This is episode 374 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can have a hand in the making of our show, as well as access bonus history content for every episode. Learn more at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned for even more details.
Hi, I'm Michael Rowan Robinson. I'm an astronomer and interested in cosmology and infrared astronomy. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Delve into where he got his story from. So it was a complete shock to me to discover, but for a couple little things, he came up with virtually nothing.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
We credit William Shakespeare with writing Romeo and Juliet because, of course, his version of this story that he wrote in the 1590s went on to be famous the world over for centuries after his lifetime, for everything from its fight scenes to the star-crossed lovers. But where did Shakespeare get his inspiration? It turns out that the play we know by the Bard was based on earlier versions of a known story, and even one poetic account that was written in England just a few years before Shakespeare was born. When our guest this week began putting together his film idea for a new take on Shakespeare's classic tale, he, like Shakespeare, turned to history for inspiration. Here this week to tell us about not only the backstory of the poems that came before Shakespeare's work, but the real people and the real history that inspired those poems that went on to inspire Shakespeare's version, as well as the story behind how Tim and his team were able to adapt this history and Shakespeare's play into a modern musical, is our guest director and writer of the new film Juliet and Romeo, Tim Scott Bogart. Timothy Scott Bogart is an American director, writer, and producer known for films like Last Full Measure and Spinning Gold. His latest work takes on the Shakespeare story of Romeo and Juliet based on historical accounts of real people from Italy, as well as the historical fiction adaptations of Romeo and Juliet that would have inspired Shakespeare himself. You can learn more about Tim and his new film in the show notes for today's episode. Before we get into the conversation today, I want to let you know that there is coordinating history content about Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet, including links to the 1562 poem Shakespeare based his story upon, along with images and more information about the real Montagues and the real Capulets, and even that real friar who hid these stories in a church archive. You can learn more about the history and the fiction that went into influencing Shakespeare's play, all packed into the show notes for our episode today. These are available for patrons of our show. You can access it at CassidyCash.com/episode 374 and click on detailed show notes to find all the extras while you listen to the show. And now let's dive into the history. Hello, Tim. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Cassidy.
Shakespeare is credited with writing Romeo and Juliet because, of course, he did write this famous play. But there was an Englishman who wrote this story before Shakespeare did. Tell us about this history.
Well, the history is spectacularly fascinating. Of course, you're referring to Mr. Arthur Brooke, which is the tragical history of Romeo and Juliet. So, I actually started my career as a stage director. Actually, I started as an actor on stage, and then ultimately I moved into being a stage director. And the first things I directed was Shakespeare, and Romeo and Juliet was just one that came to me. I'm talking about decades ago. Early on, it was a piece. I thought the themes were just so fantastic. Interestingly, while I just adore everything Mr. Shakespeare has ever done, I always kind of felt that Romeo and Juliet was sort of his poppiest play, right? Like if you think about it, it's one of the few things he really targeted towards a younger audience, which really wasn't, if you look at the breadth of his work, not normally the case.
Having a 14-year-old as your heroine helps with that. Yes.
It certainly does. Although interestingly, when you go down that road, then there's so much focus on the younger group that I think some of the elder group perhaps got a little short-shrifted. I think I actually directed it 4 times, and ultimately I think I failed. I think the reason I think that I failed is I while I was doing it, I always found these moments that I felt, gosh, there's so much more to this relationship. There's so much more about Juliet and her mom. There's so much more about this relationship between Romeo and this other person that I always felt, gosh, if there was a way to have more, that would be interesting. And it always kind of haunted me. And so I moved on with my career. I got into film and television, did other things. And then things would happen. Like suddenly I walk in and see Shakespeare in Love. And I'm like, God damn it. That's brilliant. What did I think of what that did? Tom Stopper did everything I would dream to be able to do.
It's a good movie.
Oh my God. Can I tell you something? It's not, people remember it as a good movie. It is a spectacular film. And if people haven't seen it in a while, oh my gosh, they should. It's such a brilliant understanding of the craft of creation, of this incredible time of Mr. Shakespeare, of who he perhaps was, and the parallel of where that idea came from, well, not true, in Shakespeare in Love, was fabulous. And I think it's one of the best pieces in that space. But as a creator, I was like, he did more about on that text than I wanted to. So it just kept coming back. And aside from the music, we can talk separately, it was my journey later in my career to really understand. It was interesting because as a director on stage, I didn't really go back and delve into where he got his story from. So it was a complete shock to me to discover, but for a couple little things, he came up with virtually nothing. And it wasn't just that he based it on one source material. As I started digging it, yes, Arthur Brooke, a UK poet, wrote this fabulous 78-page, if I recall, poem. And all the characters are there and the story points are there. So Shakespeare took the poem, and of course,
and it's not that far before Shakespeare either. Arthur Brooke wrote this poem in the 1560s, and Shakespeare was born in 1564. So this
Correct.
was,
and we think Shakespeare wrote it 95-ish, right, somewhere in that vein. And so, yes, Arthur Brooke was really early, but not that far apart from it. But then you go back a little bit earlier, and suddenly Arthur Brooke based his on all these Italian authors, and there's like 3 or 4 of them. Some of them, like Bandello, like really consequential pieces. As you go further and further back, you suddenly see Montague and Capulet become Montecchi and Capuletti. You sort of go back, I think it was an Italian author, Salernitano, who did Mariotta and Gianosa. So the names and the battling families kept going back from Shakespeare to a UK poet, to a number of French authors and novelists, to a Parisian, and then ultimately back to some historical records. But even in there, and we reference this in the film, the character of the great Dante Alighieri, as I was starting to study the time and place that this was happening, to find out that the great Dante Alighieri, one of the great creators of all time, was having this weird relationship with the most evil pope perhaps ever, Pope Boniface, who was in power from 1301 to 1303 and was really trying to control the entire empire before there was in Italy. And this odd relationship between the Pope and Dante was excommunicated. And where did he go during this period where these events supposedly took place?
Shall we guess?
He was suffering. Dante Alighieri is suffering in Verona at the exact same time. And when you go and you look at what those events likely could have been, he could likely have been at the same parties with the Montagues and the Capulets at that time. If you look at, and by the way, this was the moment which I adored. I tried to put it in this film, but I have plans for it later. But he was also dealing with his own writer's block, Mr. Alighieri, trying to write a little thing called the Divine Comedy, which will eventually be written. It's over a 10-year period that he makes this massive creative work. But in there, you'll see him referencing the Montagues and Capulets about 240-something years before Shakespeare was even alive. So when you go back historically, the amount of source material is rather extraordinary. And if you go back to the earliest part of the source material, you also start getting into historic public records, which during that time, it was only the church. The church was the only place that anybody felt there was any real historical documentation. There weren't really governments running at that time. There was much more nation states in this area.
Yes. And I think we should clarify that when we're saying source material here, we're not talking about how old, well, not only talking about how old the story of Romeo and Juliet is, because it does go back well before Shakespeare. But when you look through some of the history that you're referencing, there were real people
Correct. There were real people. There were
that
real
had these
families.
names and were living in Italy. So the stories are based on real people, and so it all kind of comes together in terms of
Real
what
people,
influenced Shakespeare. Yeah,
real dynamics, all of those things, and then just to sort of end that point. So the church was monitoring births and deaths and land purchases, and all that went into the historical archives, and that was the stuff of history, because it was the only way history could be played out. And I started going, okay, so Mr. Shakespeare in the 1590s is going to his source material, which was based on someone else. So it's not that he got it wrong. He just was relying on what he knew. What if there was more? And that ultimately began my journey of what if there was more, and how could I explore that through the compass of real history, this incredible source material, and of course, this unbelievable work from Mr. Shakespeare.
Which is a really cool point to make, I think, too, about storytelling in general. I was talking with someone on another podcast episode who made the statement that whenever Shakespeare ended up being so famous, that whenever we talk about his stories, we treat his versions like they're the originals, and anything that comes before Shakespeare is talked about as a source, and anything that comes after Shakespeare is talked about in adaptation. When in reality, when you're talking about artwork, all of these stories are originals in their own right. They are their story. Now, they can be influenced by or learn about different parts of their story from somewhere else, but it's not, to say that Shakespeare got it wrong because he didn't tell it the same way as a story that came before him is not the correct characterization for a work of art. So
he got it the way he wanted to express. And the only question is that all the story, or is that part of the story?
Which is what I thought was exciting about your film, is that you did take you Shakespeareified it in a way, because you took his story and asked new questions and went, well, what if this and what if that, and how would that work? Which in your research, or I guess in your framing of the narrative here of the Romeo and Juliet story, you frame it as if the story of these star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Juliet, was only ever known to history at all because it was discovered buried inside church archives. Tell us about this angle. Was this something that was born out of a question you were asking, or was there real history behind the Romeo and Juliet story being buried in a church forever?
So it was both. It was less specific to Romeo and Juliet and more specific to all people at that time in history and how history ultimately was marked. The origin of it, there's a wonderful, I would say, is an antiquities collector.
Which at that time, we're talking about the 14th century, not the 16th century when Shakespeare was
around. We're talking about 1301 to 1303.
Gotcha.
Which again, we're coming out of the medieval times, just about the birth of the Renaissance. So governments, documents, those were all, kind of shifty kind of things at the time. So you had to find some kind of place. So I remember talking to this friend of mine who specialized in the collection of historical documents. And I remember walking around his office, and he had one of, I think there were 5 left, of the Emancipation Proclamations. And then all on the walls, you see all these wonderful documents signed by all these amazing historical figures. And this is probably 10, 15 years ago. And I remember talking to him and saying, what are some of the most interesting historical mysteries for you based on your actual, tangible research? And he had a bunch of really fabulous thoughts of things, of major characters that we know in history that we thought were interesting, but places where he thought the historical documents lend an incredible insight to that. And as a result of that, I said, so tell me about kind of the birth of historical documents. It was really him explaining to me where the records came from the first real records that started to be translated. And again, at this particular time, 1301 and 1303, which becomes the birth of Italy, because Italy doesn't exist. There is no Italy at the time of the Romeo and Juliet story, but it does become Italy shortly thereafter. These historical records, he said, were the basis of land rights, were the basis of family rights, were people claim they owned this thing, and they would suddenly look back, and they started that documentation. And to me, that led me to, well, then who in the world would control that information? I guess it would be the friar, who ironically has a bit of skin in the game in this story. So it doesn't add up. And so it really was based on the historical accuracy that real documentation from that time absolutely existed and drove our only pure understanding of that time. But it's not that I specifically found a document that said Romeo and Juliet did this thing on this day at this time, because I don't have those records. Neither did Mr. Shakespeare or Arthur Brooke or anyone else. But the historical accuracy of the events is quite fascinating. And that's kind of where I found that Dante Alighieri was there at the time. Like there's real records of some of those characters' movements at the moment.
Which would suggest that they didn't have this category for the theaters during Shakespeare's lifetime, but maybe they should have. But it puts Romeo and Juliet in the category of historical fiction to give you this context for when you're trying to wrap your mind around what Shakespeare did and what you've done with your story. The reason I think first-time watchers, especially Shakespeare fans, might be surprised when they press play and the movie begins with, okay, we're set in 1301, and they're going, wait, isn't Romeo and Juliet supposed to be 16th century? So I think I'm wanting to explain that you kind of had to pick a century, really, because the story of Romeo and Juliet spans so many. If you're going to set it in a historical time period, you chose to set it when the historical events you did know about were
Correct.
going on, and then place Romeo and Juliet in that context. Right. So there was a huge amount of authenticity, historical authenticity that went into the making of this film, obviously. But that brings me to the question of, if we're going to focus so much on historical authenticity, where did the musical aspect come from? And specifically, why were the songs so very modern? I was watching it, and in one scene, the apothecary sings a song where he's talking about his neurons in the brain. And it stuck out to me because, of course, we didn't know about neurons until the 19th century. And I went, wow, the music is very, very modern, and the rest of it is very, very historical. So tell us how you arrived at the decision to go musical and to keep the music 21st century.
And those two things that you just said about the authenticity and the music are and always have been inextricably intertwined. So there's not one without the other in our kind of iteration and vision of it. But the moment was unbelievably precise and specific. And I recall it exactly. I was actually about 10 years ago. And I was still struggling with, what can I do with this idea? I love this idea. What can I do with it? And I was having lunch with my brother, Evan Bogart, who wrote all the songs in the film. He also wrote Halo for Beyonce and SOS for Rihanna, so a major pop writer. But I remember sitting with him going, I'm struggling with this approach I have. And I'm curious, why do you think Shakespeare used iambic pentameter? And it was an honest question going, because it's not easy, iambic pentameter. So
never mind that.
It could be eating vegetables. Right?
Centuries of Shakespeareans have asked this question, so it's not an easy one to answer.
It's not, but his answer was fascinatingly easy and interesting to me because he said, because that was the poetry of his time. And I thought about that for a second and said, okay, so if iambic pentameter it clearly is poetic, is the poetry of his time, then what's the poetry of our time? And he said, pop music. Now I laughed because he's a pop music writer, right? So of course he's going to say his thing. But I said, but tell me why. He said, look at the generation of young people. There is no them without their music. It's not something that's in the background. It is part of who they are. It's what they listen to 24 hours a day. Music is their inner voice. We write pop music to tap into these real human beings' inner struggles, inner life. And this music, the way this music gets into the soul, becomes the poetry of their time. And I started thinking about inner voice, which of course, in directing Shakespeare on the stage, his inner monologues are just some of the greatest things ever. And I thought, he always raised the roof with that inner voice when the stuff was just beyond the scene. There was something emotional that had to be expressed. And isn't that ultimately the same about music? However, I always felt strongly, while I love musicals and I love musical theater, I've always felt there's two kinds of musicals. There's the musical where like the milkman is singing and the milkman clearly knows he's in a musical, so much so that his cow even seems to know he's in a musical and is singing, right? Not my cup of tea. I mean, fine, just not really the thing that I particularly love. And then there's that musical where it really is inner voice. And I thought, gosh, this age group, these young people, their yearning, their desires, it is all inner struggle. And if I could capture that inner life through this music that relates to them today, that will allow me to take these incredible themes from yesterday and bring them all together. And so it really was this version of this conversation about iambic pentameter leading to what is poetry in general, leading to the power of music, and then what kind of music in terms of how I want to adapt it. So that's ultimately kind of where the origin was.
I've heard that description in studying iambic pentameter. For Shakespeare's lifetime, it was this: if you could write well in iambic pentameter, you were demonstrating that, hey, I belong here. I am a professional at what I do. But the comparison of it to pop music is a great one. And I see how that would be reflected in using pop music in the telling of the film, for sure.
Just that point, I know people might reference the Broadway show and Juliet, which is a pop music for sure, but it's a very different thing. That is specifically pre-existing jukebox musical, which to me, I loved it. However, when I saw it, when those songs came, it kind of pushed me back because I know those songs. It didn't pull me in. And our mission always was, we're going into these inner souls of these kids, not stepping back to see a big dance number. Right. So kind of a different approach.
Well, I know that this film is going to have us all excited to look into the backstory of Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare's inspiration for these films. So if we're new to this, if this is the first time we've heard that Shakespeare relied heavily on a 1562 poem for his version, where should we go if we want to explore this history further? I guess maybe what were some of your resources you really relied on when you were making the film?
So in terms of the true text sort of background are the ones that we talked about. I mean, people really, if people are interested in this story, they should read the Arthur Brooke poem because they will be blown away. I remember the first time I read it going, it's all here. It was so mind-boggling to me because I was like, yes. I had no idea. And then I felt bad that I had no idea. So I think that just as a general understanding of what adaptation might even mean, I think it's super interesting to look at Shakespeare's text and look at Mr. Brooks' poem and go, that's a very interesting thing I've just discovered. Now, similarly, go back to Bandello's book, because I think that's probably another key component from Shakespeare that he probably drew from, because there's a lot of similarities there. So all the books are interesting, but I think those two, I think the Matteo Bandello one, and I think, and I certainly know the Arthur Brooke one, I think are incredibly, incredibly potent. And then I know I've already said it, but if you want to, play and explore adaptation, I don't think there's a better lecture than Shakespeare in Love as a movie. And if you haven't seen it, go see it. And if you've seen it already, see it again. You'll go, oh my gosh, I love this the first time. Those I can't tell you how many times I watched. I know that you've talked about the difference between, Elizabethan, England and the time, when Shakespeare was there. The Romeo and Juliet story was always meant to be an Italian story that took place in Italy and not in England. So it was different. But I studied every frame, not just for the story, but even the way different world in the 1500s and the 1300s, but even to understand the world, the crowds, the stuff. And I know they're 100 years apart, but it's just a beautiful rendition of a true immersive experience into a place and time. And I think those are all really fascinating places to go.
We will place links to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode so that you can see those, as well as links to where you can watch the film. And I will throw out, having seen it, I thought visually it was very stunning. The colors and the way that you did the way that you relied on historical lighting, but you didn't feel like you were in the dark the whole time was cool. I still don't know how you managed that, but that was neat.
Let me tell you, Cassidy, because, and I just want to stop that because that was arguably one of the hardest decisions about this film. And going back 6 months before production, my director of photography, Byron Werner, and I, we watched everything you could watch on the planet Earth that has ever been produced anywhere around this time. And if you go back and look at it, virtually all of it is so dark and drab and gray and not terribly inviting for a modern audience. But why? Because there was no electricity. And it's always cold and there was always cloudy. And perhaps more importantly, for this specific story of Romeo and Juliet, so much takes place at night. So now you don't even have this. We have a couple scenes during the day, but almost all of it's at night. So how do you make a movie that takes place entirely at night that is supposed to be devoid of electricity? What do you have to use? So it's like, well, we have fire and the moon, which became our dual enemies throughout the course of the thing. Because once we started, if you see the movie, none of those flames are fake. Every time we started, we had 25 Italians running around lighting each thing for every single shot because light not only was beautiful, it was essential or everything would be black. Second thing is the moon. Okay, challenge there. Where is the moon? Is it on the left side or is it on the right side? If you need light coming from the other side of the bridge, but the moon's only on that side of the bridge. So we took a leap, admittedly, that the moon had its own otherworldly ability to kind of move around a little bit. So if you're really analyzing it, you'll see our light source is a little tricky, but ultimately it was the complete embrace of fire and moon, and then the complete exquisite electricity of the colors that the extraordinary Dante Ferretti, one of the great production designers who's ever worked in this world, was able to bring to the table, along with the amazing costumes by Luciano Capozzi. Those colors elevated everything and allowed us to put it in this almost technicolor world that still felt unbelievably authentic, which ultimately, authenticity, which was an earlier question you asked too, I never thought we'd get away with any of this musical journey if the rest of it wasn't so perfectly grounded and real that audience felt, I get that. I understand that person. So it was an interesting challenge.
Which I think is a neat thing to keep in mind. As Shakespeareans, we spent a lot of time living in the 16th century. And when we watch this film, it's fun to think about that Shakespeare had those same constraints when he was trying to put this story on stage. You know, at the Globe,
Yes.
they would rely on things like sunlight or moonlight because there wasn't electricity and,
Absolutely.
fire on stage. So it's pretty fun to think about what those struggles would have looked like. And I have to tell you also that I think one of my favorite parts of the film was how you captured the street gang feel without it being too, it wasn't the Leonardo DiCaprio version with the guns in the street, but you still had that warring families in a town kind of storytelling.
I'm so happy you brought that up, Cassie, because it was arguably one of my biggest hopes and desires for the piece, because when I was directing on stage, I always felt that the teams, if you will, right? It was always us versus them, Montagues versus Capulet, but I always felt that was given a bit shorter shrift, and that ultimately, when you get to something as consequential for the people who know of Mercutio and Tybalt's climax, it never felt as earned, I thought, as it should be. And it never, frankly, felt as powerful as it could be, because I didn't know that I believed always Romeo and Juliet. I don't know that I believed the rest. And so when I looked at it, and I love to even talk about it as a street game, to me, we have this wonderful opening where Juliet arrives to Verona in the town square. It's just Friday night. And that's where kids go. It's Friday night. They're in the square. There's a band over there. So it's not just a musical. It's a musical world, because youth brings that musicality. And so the idea that these characters could have almost been friends, which if you're really looking at how I've devised it, even the opening battle that occurs between Mercutio and Tybalt, you get the sense maybe on another night they go get a beer. It's not just that. And then tragedy starts to take hold. And I just felt it had more weight to it by giving more life to all of those characters, which I was able to do in a situation, which is wonderful.
Yeah, definitely a film worth seeing. And we will, as I say, put links to all of these resources and where you can check out the film in the show notes for today's episode. Now, Tim, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those. And apparently... In addition, yes. And apparently on the original Desert Island Disc show, where we pull this question from, you are also offered a luxury item. So if you'd like, you can also select a luxury item to have on your island stay as well.
Okay. And only one book, though, in addition. Only one.
Yeah.
Two that I'm struggling with. Ultimately, there's a wonderful autobiography by Frank Capra, and it speaks to such brilliant kind of journey and search for why he ended up doing what he did in life, and as an artist, what that responsibility was. And so Frank Capra's autobiography is something I go back to often, because I just think it's an interesting compass.
That sounds like an excellent choice for your desert island stay. And you are the first person in That Shakespeare Life history to have chosen the autobiography of Frank Capra. So you have that honor as well. So what's next for you? Do you think that you'll do any more Shakespeare?
The structure, in fact, of this particular film was and is always meant to be one of three films. There's quite a bit more story here, as I talked about this sort of period between 1301 and 1303, where the Pope it's really church versus state, and this incredible battle that is occurring during the region. And we've got plans for these characters and these families and these people and other people like Mr. Alighieri. And so my hope is enough people are thrilled with what we've done on this first one that we get to go and continue the tale over the next two.
Ooh, that would be exciting. I can't wait to see what happens next. Thank you so much for meeting with us today, Timothy Scott Bogart. It was fun getting to hear about this new movie that offers a special twist on Shakespeare's classic tale and brings to life the history that story was based upon. Be sure to check out the new film, Juliet and Romeo, now in theaters and available on all major streaming platforms. Thanks, Tim. It was great talking with you today.
Thank you so much. Great pleasure.
For more information on Tim Scott Bogart and links to where you can watch his latest film based on Shakespeare's classic tale, as well as helpful lists of the resources he recommends for you to use to learn more, you can check that out in the show notes for today's episode at cassidycash.com/episode 374. Remember, while you're there, if you want to be one of the listeners who gets to vote on future episodes, as well as to submit your suggestions for topics you want covered on the podcast, then sign up as a patron right now by clicking the detailed show notes at cassidycash.com/episode 374. That's cassidycash.com/EP374. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.